Welcome back to the Vintage Ballers podcast. I'm your host, Brad Coreno, and on today's episode, we have Coach Earl Thomas joining the show. Earl is a longtime assistant and head men's basketball coach at the University of Rio Grande, where he is one of the most storied coaches in the history of the school. So without further ado, please welcome Earl Thomas. But I want to explain to everybody, who's going to be listening to this. Coach Thomas has gone back with my family for 30 years now. My brother, of course, played at the University of Rio Grande, and Coach Thomas is one of the assistants back then, and of course, the head coach later on. So it's an honor having you on the show, Coach, and I'm really looking forward to going through your career, your life, and then, of course, we'll talk about my brother as well and get into his college days. So I want to start, Coach, with going back to your childhood, and, where did you grow up, and when did you fall in love with the game of basketball?
Grew up in a small town of Cheshire, which is about 20 or 25 miles from Rio Grande. Played high school basketball at Kiger Creek High School, and actually came to Rio Grande with the hopes of playing here. But I really wasn't good enough. Now I tell people that I had a knee injury and blew out my knee my freshman year. And the only thing that did was save me the embarrassment of getting cut. So it did not end a stellar basketball career.
And were there any, back in those days, were there any favorite players of yours? I like to talk about the great Bevo Francis too, of course, but were any favorite professional or college players back in those days that you had?
Yeah, I kind of grew up obviously an Ohio State fan. So from a fairly early age, I remember Lucas and Havlicek and the teams at Ohio State, and of course Oscar Robertson at Cincinnati. I also was a fan of Rupp's Runts from Kentucky. Mm-hmm. So I followed them a little bit, but that was a different day. We didn't get a lot of basketball, either college or professional, on TV. We'd maybe get an NBA game on Sunday or a college basketball game once in a while. So a lot of my time following teams was done on the radio.
Really? Yeah. And it's interesting you say that, because my dad always talks about listening to the radio back in those days as well.
Right.
And,
right.
And obviously you didn't get a lot of TV games. He always talks about baseball, and there's only certain games on during the week. So
right.
It wasn't like now where every day you could watch whatever you want. But
oh yeah, I would have been a total junkie growing up in today. So I wouldn't have done anything but watch TV.
Well, it's funny. The kids don't even know how good they have it, as far as, they have almost too much at their disposal at this point.
I really do think at times they have too much. I think it creates false impressions and a lot of bad habits.
Yeah, it does. I agree. And I grew up in that in-between era where we had some, we had Nintendos and we had some of the, video games coming out, but it wasn't social media like it is today, where it's everywhere and 24 hours a day. So I kind of grew up in between.
Well, and I have a feeling Joe probably didn't let you guys sit around the house and lollygag very much.
No, he liked, we played a lot of sports, obviously. So he was always outside. We were playing baseball, wiffle ball, football, basketball, you name it. We were always out doing something. And watching my brother, Coach, growing up watching my brother, it'd be snowing out and he'd be shooting baskets. That's just how he was. So, and his work ethic and what he's all about. But I didn't really get that until I got older. I just thought he was crazy when I was younger. Then you get older and you're like, oh, I get it now. But
he's still got that work ethic. I saw a picture on Facebook earlier this year of he and his boys out shooting basketball in the snow.
Yep.
So some things never change.
No, some things never change. Exactly. And he's just one of those, he's a special kind of guy in that way. But I learned a lot from him. And I can't wait to get to the Rio days, of course. We'll get into that a little bit later, but there's just so much I want to talk about, because I was a kid then. So I didn't fully get how good he was and how fun it was watching him at Rio Grande until I got older. And then I really went back, and I wish I can go back again and relive all that. But let's get to, so going into your high school, college days, did you ever have a mindset of one day I want to become a coach, and one day I want to get into coaching?
I did. It really, when I came to college, of course, I thought about playing basketball, and my initial goal was to be a physical education major and then go on to coach. And after the knee injury, I was kind of disenchanted and shelved that idea for a little bit, changed my major and became a communication major. And I really think, Brad, as luck would have it, it was the best move I ever made, because I learned so much about how to interact with people, small group communication, conflict resolution, all of the things that come into play every day in coaching. So I think it was really a blessing in disguise. And when I kind of got over the feeling sorry for myself because I couldn't play anymore, um, the idea of coaching never really left. So when Coach Lawhorn took over in 1980, I had come back here. I got my graduate degree and was teaching in communication. And yeah, I think he kind of heard through the grapevine and some other people that I was a little bit of a basketball junkie. So he asked me to join his staff, and that's when it started.
So let's take us back to the 1980. Where was the Rio Grande program at that point? And obviously, take us a little bit through the legacy of Bevo Francis, because there's a lot of listeners, especially some of the older listeners. I know I travel a lot around the country, and a lot of the guys I sell to who are maybe in their 60s or 70s remember his name. Like Bevo
Yeah.
Francis, the Bevo Francis. I said, yeah, So tell us about his legacy for people who don't know who he was.
Yeah. Well, it's really an amazing story. He came to Rio Grande in the early 50s, basically recruited by his high school coach, Newt Oliver. And he was a phenom. He was 6'10", 6'11", could handle the ball, could run. I mean, he was really an amazing athlete, and had just an unbelievable ability to score the basketball. We have seen some film of him playing, and Brad, he was knocking down hook shots from the top of the key.
Wow.
Had they had the 3-point line, Lord only knows how many points he would have scored, because he scored a lot of his points outside the paint.
Oh, I didn't know that. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, he was just a remarkable scorer. So, kind of grew up knowing that legacy, and Coach Lanham had been here for 20 years before that, and had had good success. But Rio Grande had not been back to the national tournament since the 1950s when Bevo played here. So when Coach Lawhorn took over, one of our goals was we want to get Rio back into the national tournament. And it took us 4 or 5 years, but finally the 84-85 team got back into the national tournament for the first time since the 1950s.
And what was that like getting back to that tournament? That had to be incredible after not being there for so long.
Yeah, it was. It really, this community. It's small, and everybody gets to know the players and so on. We had great parental support, great fan support, and it really got the community juiced up. They had classes with the radio on during the day when we were playing in the tournament. So it was great atmosphere, and something like that's really good for a small campus.
Oh yeah, definitely. And through the 80s, coach, did you see the program? I mean, at that point you made the tournament, of course, in the mid 80s. Did you see it just progressing as time went on? I mean, could you feel the change?
Yeah, you could. It became much easier for us to recruit because of the success we had, and I think a variety of things helped our recruiting. We always tried to get our players involved in recruiting as much as possible. We had a standard rule when we brought a recruit on campus. They played against our guys. We had our guys take them to eat. If they spent the night, they would spend the night with our guys. And we had a standard rule. If our players at a time before we made a firm offer, we would tell them if there are any reasons you don't want to invite this person into your program, tell us now. And we actually had that happen a couple of times.
Really?
Players pick up on things, so that they really had veto power. And if they said, "Hey, this guy's good. We would like to have him in the program," then we made the offer.
No.
So I think that really adds a lot to the camaraderie of the team and the bonding process that any good team has to go through.
Well, I find that very interesting because obviously a lot of recruiting the recruiting process doesn't include players typically. So to include them in that, I think is really interesting. And I find that to be, as far as building camaraderie, I mean, if I knew I was part of, selecting who's coming to play with me in the following season, that makes a big difference.
Yeah.
What were some of the, types of players that you guys didn't want? I'm sure big egos and things like that, but were there any like red flags right away that would come up and you're like, yeah, we don't want this guy?
Yeah, there really were. And it depended on a lot of the situations. What we would typically do, Brad, is if we got the name of a player or somebody recommending them, we would obviously call the coach and talk to him about it. And then we would also try to contact the principal or other teachers, maybe if we knew teachers in that school system. We would call other coaches in the league and find out, all right, what's this kid like on the floor? Are there any problems? And if there were any social or academic problems or problems in terms of getting along with teammates, we probably would end the recruiting process before it ever got started. So, we used to tell our guys, if you see us show up in the gym, we've probably already done some homework on you. Because we weren't going to waste a trip all the way to North Olmsted to find a kid who was a jerk. So we'd already checked Brett out a little bit before we came to see him play, and that takes care of a lot of problems down the road.
Oh yeah.
So we pretty much knew what we were getting. We also, to be quite honest, we evaluated parents, because how a parent reacts and treats things tells you a whole lot about what kind of problem you're going to have with the kid. Mm-hmm. And when we were talking to parents, if they started bad mouthing the high school coach, we were done, because pretty much we knew if they're bad mouthing this guy, they're going to be bad mouthing us in 2 years.
Yep.
And we don't need those headaches.
No.
So we wanted parents who, like your dad, were a little tough. And if Brett called and said, Dad, the coach isn't being very nice to me, Joe's going to tell him to play a little harder. Mm-hmm. And we wanted the parents involved, and we wanted everybody to know exactly what we expected from the player and what we expected, or what they could expect from us day one. And that way there weren't any questions going forward.
And how long did it take you guys to create that culture of knowing exactly what you want, the ideal player that you want, the ideal parents, et cetera?
Yeah, I think it took us a few years. But then it was one of those, almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I'm guessing if you ask your mom and dad, when they came to a Rio game, they sat with other Rio parents, because the parents got to know each other. And they would visit in each other's homes, and we would have the parents of recruits call the parents of our current players to talk to them, and we told them, be very honest. So it really helped that whole family atmosphere a little bit. And I'm sure you guys remember when you would follow Brett to games, there'd be a lot of Rio parents there, no matter where we were playing.
Absolutely.
And once that started, it just kept developing. And we had that pretty much throughout the entirety of our program.
That is one of the things as a child that I remember going to the games in the early 90s and sitting in the crowds with the Rio fans. I don't care if we were at Walsh or Tiffin or Mount Vernon, wherever we were, Banna, and I remember going to all those places, and
absolutely,
there was always a big Rio crowd, and
yeah.
I didn't exactly know who was who, because I was, probably 10 years old then, and I was just more worried about, going in the hallway and playing with my basketball. But at the same time, I remember the camaraderie, and I can remember my, how passionate fans were back then. And
I can remember, I don't know whether it was after maybe a game at Dyke or someplace. We came to your house. The whole team came there, and your folks fed us.
I think it was Dyke. Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah. Yep.
We would have that quite often. And it, I think that made the players even closer, because they got to know all of the parents, and well, you know what? That's just a fun atmosphere to coach in. Yeah, when you've got that kind of support and those kind of kids, it really makes it fun.
Now, before we get to the days of my brother and Matt Powell and all those guys, what in the late 80s, so you made the tournament 84, 85, What other successes did you have, in the late 80s to kind of build that program?
We went back again in '87, and then we had a pretty good run again. I think '89, '92 with Brad and those guys, '95. So we had a pretty good streak for a while. And again, I just think it's based on the kids you bring in. We weren't basketball geniuses by any stretch of the imagination, but we simply understood what our system was, and we tried to teach kids to play within that system. And once they understood it, things became a lot easier. Our system wasn't terribly complicated. It was fairly simple, but we really worked very hard on teaching good, sound fundamentals, and making sure the kids understood how to play. And then we just kind of let it happen.
And tell us about Coach Lawhorn. I mean, obviously he's a legend, and I remember him very well as a kid. And what was his basketball philosophy?
John's philosophy, and you know what, it changed. And I think to a certain extent, especially now, coaches have to change with the times. Mm-hmm. Coach grew up, he was a little bit old school, and it was, you had to come in to practice ready. And Brett will tell you, we never went more than 2 hours, but it better be 2 hours of intensity. And you had to understand the system, and you had to be a good citizen. We set some rules for our guys, and they didn't miss class. If they walked into a building, the hats came off, and they had to have shirt tails tucked in, and I kept that philosophy as a head coach, and I tried to tell our guys, this every day for you is a job interview. We're not only preparing you for basketball, we're preparing you for life after basketball. And this is what people want out of their employees. So you're going to demonstrate this on a daily basis. And again, I think that developed some pride in the program that everybody had to go through the same process. And if one of our guys missed class, if they screwed up and overslept, then they had that first call they made had to be to the professor. Second call better be to us. And then when we got to practice that night, the whole team got on the line and ran suicides because that guy missed class.
Oh, wow.
So what we found out was if guys weren't going to miss very many classes because their teammates didn't want to run because of them. So that peer pressure kept them going to class every day. And that worked out pretty well.
And as far as like the offense and defensive schemes, did you guys have any particular offense or defense that you ran, or was it kind of changing with the personnel that you had?
It changed some based on personnel. I mean, we ran when Coach first came, we ran kind of what was known as the old Boston Celtic fast break. Then we adapted that a little bit when the 3-point line became a factor. We changed things to allow us to shoot the three, and we were probably one of the early teams to go to really pushing an up-tempo game, which is the one you remember. I know.
Oh, yeah.
When Brett was here, we had our four men were launching threes: Jeff Brown, Brad Coreno.
Yep.
So we tried to score quick, and which was great. Now it gave us a lot more possessions, and as the defensive coordinator, it drove me crazy. But we put a lot of points on the board, and that was something that I think also helped our recruiting. Kids like to play in a style where they're getting up and down the floor and throwing up 90 to 100 points a game. So our philosophy changed as the game changed. And we simply felt like at times we had to make some adjustments in order to stay relevant and to recruit the kind of kids we wanted to recruit.
And you bring up the stretch fours back then, and just, the guys like Jeff Brown and my brother who were shooting threes. I actually had Pete Chilcutt on the show. He played for North Carolina and the Houston Rockets. He was on the Olajuwon 95 team, and he was kind of a stretch four, came off their bench and hit some big threes in some playoff games. And he was telling me, Brad, back then I was like an outcast. Like there wasn't You just didn't do that in the NBA back then. It was guys like Ewing and Robinson, and you didn't launch threes as a 6'10" guy. You just didn't do
Yeah.
that. So it was like back then that was that was progressive back then. You just didn't have that type of style. That's why
we were one of the first to go to that and start recruiting kids specifically for what we wanted to run. And coaches used to tell us, you're the most difficult team we have to prepare for because nobody else does what you do. So we were a little difficult. And also what that meant was, and you remember some of the guys that Brad played with or that Brett played with, all of a sudden now our post players were down on inside and they never got double teamed. Troy Donaldson couldn't tell you what a double team looked like because we had your brother and we had Schubert and Ursuline and Powell and some of those guys that could shoot the three, and it was pick your poison. So when we threw it down inside, there was nobody there, and our post players loved it.
I mean, I remember so vividly watching that. And I remember there was a game at Walsh, and this might have been later on, maybe 94, 93, 94, but they had a kid named, I think, Corey Alpine. He was a great player. And I think another kid named Young. They had a really good team. And It was a back and forth. But those guys pretty much stayed inside, though. I mean, Corey and those guys, they were more pounders inside. Where my brother, I remember launching some threes that game. And it was just, I didn't understand the philosophies back then. But looking back at it now, it was interesting how you guys are playing that. It was such a different type of offense.
Corey Appline was a man. I mean, he was just a big, strong kid who was going to bang down inside. But when he had to come out on the perimeter and guard Brett, he was a fish out of water. So,
exactly.
we just spread the floor and Brett shot it from out there and he had to go out and guard him. So consequently, he wasn't able to rebound and do some of the things that he wanted to do down inside. And they had Jeff Young.
Yep, Jeff Young. That was it. Yep.
We had some great battles with Walsh back then. That started in the early '80s when Huggins was there, and we had some great battles with him for a couple of years. So that was always a tremendous rivalry.
Oh, I remember that the gym being packed. I remember I was probably in third or fourth grade, and I remember going to one of those games, and it was a big deal. And I think it was right around the Super Bowl because I remember everybody was talking about the Bills. I think it was another Bills Super Bowl, and everyone was talking about who they think's going to win the next day.
Yeah, that was a great conference.
Yep, it really was. It really was. I mean, I remember all those gyms. I remember going to Tiffin. Mount Vernon was a great place. I mean, I probably went to 6 or 7 different gyms or arenas back in that day, and I remember all of them pretty well. And it was I think Cedarville might have been one of them.
Cedarville was good. Walsh, Malone from the Canton area.
Yep. Central State, I believe.
Yeah, Central State was in. Now Findlay for a while was in our league, and then they went into the GLIAC. But then we had Ohio Dominican and Urbana, Mount Vernon, some of those schools. So it was there weren't very many nights off in that league. You better come to play.
And if I remember correctly, I think Priest Lauderdale played at Central State, the 7'4". He played in the Bulls for a while, and he was a monster.
He did, and I still remember the game we were preparing to go against him, and Brett couldn't figure out how he was going to guard a 7-foot guy. And I said, it's not going to do you good to try to block his shot.
No.
So just push him out and let him go. But Brett, again, went out on the floor and started shooting threes, and Lauderdale had to come out and guard him and got him in early foul trouble. So he was on the bench most of the game, and we ended up beating him pretty easily.
And I think that's one of the few games my brother actually dunked. He didn't dunk many times. For a guy who could fly around, he really wasn't a dunker. And I believe that's one of the games he dunked.
Yeah, he did there, and he did one night at Urbana.
Okay.
In a big game, I think that maybe sealed the conference for us or something, because after he dunked it, he ran by our bench and smiled. And we had never seen that before.
No, that wasn't like him at all.
No, that was not like he was not a big taunter on the floor, but he was taunting us that night.
So let's go back and that whole era now. I want to talk about all those guys because I grew up with, my brother, of course, and Jeff Brown and Jack Morgan and Walter Stevens and Jason Curtis. We go on, the Caldwell brothers, Matt Powell. I mean, there's so many names I can mention. The recruiting process, did you realize how special of a team that would become and how those guys would kind of gel? Jeff Hepner is another guy. Give us the process of how you guys brought all those kids together.
I think you always hope that you'll have teams gel like that. But that always depends on the personality of the guys. And all of those guys that you mentioned were so unselfish, and they got along so well. Winning was important to them. Pride in the program was important to them. So they really enjoyed playing with each other. They enjoyed practicing with each other. I mean, I can remember Jeff Brown, and I'm sure your brothers told you stories. Brett left the court his freshman year bloody most nights. Jeff Brown was just a big, strong, physical, hard-nosed kid who could also shoot it, pass it, shoot the three. And he really toughened Brett up his freshman year, and they would just beat the crap out of each other in practice, and then they'd leave as buddies and go together. It was really a good relationship, and I'm sure Brett gives Brownie a whole lot of credit.
Oh yeah.
For turning him into the player that he was. But that was the Rio culture at that time. The older guys, we gave them responsibility. You need to teach the new guys how to act and what their responsibility is. And if they screw up, it's partially your fault. So they took it seriously. And 20, 30 years later, as I play golf with those guys, they still talk about that, and they take great pride in the kind of camaraderie that they help establish.
And I remember my brother's freshman year, how tough it was on him. I mean, he would come home and say how physical it is. And I mean, obviously college compared to high school is always more physical, but I don't think he realized the amount of physicality that college basketball. I mean, it's not, I don't care what division you're playing in. It's a lot of physicality. And I have guys who played in all divisions on this show, and it's a brutal game. I mean, it's especially back then. This is back in the early 90s.
It's
so
a huge difference. And it's hard to explain to guys in high school what it is they're going to face. And that's why we normally in the recruiting process like to have them come down and go against our guys, so that, in April and May when we're recruiting them, if they get their butts kicked in an open gym with those guys, they've still got a few months to get in the weight room and start getting stronger so that they're ready when they come on campus in September.
And what is, that process like getting a freshman in? So you got like my brother came in 91. What was that process like? Do you usually fill a freshman out for a year and just see where he fits in the team? Do you already have a spot you think he could fit in?
It depends on the player. We had situations where we had a kid by the name of Jerry Mowry that was the first point guard really that we recruited. Came in 1981. We handed him the basketball day one, and he was our starting point guard for 4 years. We had a situation with Jack Morgan. If you remember, Jack Morgan started as a freshman, and poor kid probably weighed 140 pounds soaking wet. And we take him the first month or two to Georgetown, who was ranked number 1 in the country, to play against them, and they just beat him unmercifully. But he was tough enough. He kept going. So, some guys we felt were good enough to come in and play immediately. Others, it maybe took a year or two, but it just simply depended on how well they adjusted and how well they could fit into the system. Some guys who came out of really strong high school programs obviously fit in much quicker. And for other guys maybe that didn't have similar systems to us, it took a little while.
And back in those days in the early 90s, my brother's era, do you have any favorite memories or favorite games you look back on in those 4 years, 91, 92, 93, 94, 95? Because I remember you guys made the tournament in 95, obviously. We'll get to that in a second. But do you have any other memories back then that stick out?
You know what? There are always some games that stick out, but I think it's more moments. And one of the real fun things now is when I get together with Hepner and Brett and all those guys to play golf. They're the ones who bring up the moments that are special, and even the guys like Jason Curtis that didn't get to play a lot took great pride in sitting on the bench and ragging the other team about that. You better guard 33 or you better guard Coreno because he's going to shoot it. And just listening to those guys and how much fun they had playing together. I think those are probably some of the better memories. But yeah, I mean, the games were special, and we had a lot of success back then, and it was just fun going along for the ride and letting those guys carry us.
I mean, it really was fun as a kid watching all that. And I knew you guys were a good team. I knew you were successful. Again, I was so young, I didn't fully take it all in. I didn't get it until I got older. And then I realized how special it all was. But I remember my brother winning MVP of the conference for the first time in '94. And again, I knew it was a big deal, but I didn't realize how big or what, I didn't, none of this sunk in for me till years later. And it's looking back now, coach, how, for Brett example, for those back-to-back MVPs, what made him such a special player on the court in those days?
I think his heart. We knew getting him out of high school that he had some ability. He his shot looked a little unorthodox. It just kept going in. He wasn't the most graceful human being. He spent more time on the floor. We used to call him the human mop. He was constantly getting knocked down. But he would continue to battle. He just had a huge heart. And he took coaching well. He demanded coaching. He wanted to know what he had to do to improve. And I'm sure you understand this, but he's the only two-time MVP in the history of the Mid-Ohio Conference. Mm-hmm. And we had some great players in that conference. Mm-hmm. Matt Powell being one of them.
Yep.
And when you look down of all of the great teams and all of the great players down through the years in that conference, and to think he was the only two-time MVP in that conference is just a tremendous credit to his heart. We had guys who were faster, had guys that were stronger, had guys that were bigger, but we never had anybody with more heart or determination than him.
And I appreciate you saying that. And with Brett, obviously he's very modest. He would hate even us talking about this. He just doesn't like talking about himself like that. But
the way he's kicked my butt in golf the last several years, I don't really like talking about it this way either. I already told him I was going to roast him on here, so I'm a little upset that we have to praise him this much.
I love it. Yeah, he was watching him back then. Again, as his little brother, I didn't fully get all of this back then. I just knew because he would come home and mess around with me, and it was typical little brother, big brother stuff. But I knew he was a great player. And you mentioned Matt Powell. I mean, I always rag on Matt. Matt had Steph Curry range back then. I mean, he was shooting. I remember watching him shoot a three. He must have been 30 feet away, 30, 35 feet, and hit one. I don't know where we were, if it was Finley or Tiffin, but I remember thinking, wow. I mean, that he had some range.
His range was unbelievable. And an interesting story on him, and it was, again, one of our recruiting philosophies. One of the things we understood was if we were going to win our conference, we had to steal a couple of kids every few years that people in the Mid-American Conference, by the time these guys were juniors, were saying, you know what, we should have recruited that kid. So we went after guys, and Brett was one of them, that teams in the MAC would look at and say, well, we think he's a step slow. And we would agree. And then we would just recruit the heck out of him. And Matt Powell was kind of one of those guys. Now, he was a brilliant student. He ended up signing at the Air Force Academy originally.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And we recruited the heck out of him, knew there was a good chance that we might not get him. But one of the things we always hoped for was what we called a bounce back, that somebody maybe would go Division I, it wouldn't work out, and they would bounce back to us. And Matt went to the Air Force Academy, and that lifestyle just did not suit him. So I think it was about October, November, he called and said, are you guys still interested? And we said, absolutely. So he transferred in and redshirted the rest of that year. And his first game in a Rio uniform, he went 7 for 10 from the three. So that gave us a pretty good indicator that this guy's something special. And his range was just remarkable.
It really was.
Yeah, people simply could not guard him. And the worst thing you could do is if you started trash talking him, you're really in trouble because he just that motivated him. So Yeah, he had a great career. It's why he's the number 2 scorer in the history of the school.
Yep. And
Uh,
I remember watching games. I mean, Jack, how fast he was as a point guard, getting the ball up the court. Walter, I mean, all those guys, the Caldwell brothers. Like, it was so fun to watch that group. Of course, Hepner was fantastic inside. Before then,
yep,
it was Jeff Brown. So it was just so many talented guys, and they all fit perfectly together. They just worked really well together.
yeah,
And I remember both of the '94 and '95 seasons. You guys had great years, and I remember you guys going to the tournament in '95 because I was in 5th grade, and I was thinking about it. You were playing when I was in school, and I was wondering who was winning. And I wish back then we had social media because I could have kept up with it. But
yeah.
um, take us back to that. Do you remember, specifically who you played? Was it Hawaii Pacific or was somebody like that? I can't remember what team it was. But
We had played Hawaii Pacific, yeah. And again, the NAI was so good back in those days. That was was all basically one division. And what a lot of people didn't understand about the NAIA was west of the Mississippi, there really weren't very many Division II or Division III schools in terms of NCAA. It was either Division I or it was NAIA. So a lot of the NAIA schools would have been equivalent to maybe the MAC or some other schools at that time, just incredibly talented. And so we had to recruit in order to go against those guys. So once you get to the national tournament, then you're really in for some battles because those guys were they were Mid-American Conference level teams, and so we felt like we had to recruit to that level if we were going to be successful.
and it's funny. I had Dennis Hobson on the show, who's Ohio State's all-time leading scorer and played, for the Bulls and the NBA, and he's coaching at Lord's University. And he said, "Hey, we just beat Rio Grande last year." He goes, "Tell your brother that." So I was
Yeah.
kind of laughing, but he said the same thing about the NAI and just how tough it is, and it was. I think the NAI, for people who don't know much about it, I mean, growing up watching it myself, I mean, it was a great. I mean, the Middle Ohio Conference was fantastic, and there was a lot of talent. And I mean, every night was. I remember going to Findlay and all those colleges we mentioned, and just the battles. I mean, it was just
Well,
constant battles.
and one of the things we always tried to do, and I got a couple of games after I took over as head coach, is we would try to get some Division I teams on the schedule. Number one, for some financial guarantee, and just the idea of going against that level of competition. And if we could play them, then nobody in our conference was going to intimidate us. So I would call some of my contacts, Dan Dockage and Larry Hunter and some of these guys, about playing a game. And Dockage said, I love you, brother, but I ain't playing you. It's not going to happen. And finally, in '01, I talked Larry Hunter into playing us, and that happened to be the year we went to the Final Four.
Oh, really?
So we battled him pretty hard, and when we shook hands afterwards, and we'd played a lot of golf together, we were good friends. We shook hands after the game, and he said, "Don't ever ask me to play you again. It's not happening."
Oh, wow.
So those guys in that area, they knew how good our league was, and that really the only thing in many cases that separated us from some of the good MAC teams were the 6'9", 6'10" post players. In terms of perimeter players, there were a lot of similarities. We could play with those guys.
And back then, the MAC, I mean, back in the '90s, you had Gary Trent, Antonio Daniels. Back in Antonio Gates played for Kent. You got a lot of talent in that conference. So it was. I mean, again, for both the NAI, the MOC conference, and the MAC conference in Division One, NCAA, Ohio had a ton of talent.
Ohio was a great recruiting ground for talent, and you had to work it really hard in order to get it. But there were a lot of great players in Ohio, and there still are. I mean, you look that there are people playing all over the country. Baylor just won a national championship this year, and they got a kid from Gallipolis sitting on the bench.
Really?
Redshirted. Yeah, 7'1" kid who may have a chance to play.
No kidding.
In the future. So Ohio is still a very fertile recruiting ground for everybody in the country.
It really is. I mean, CJ McCollum, went to Canton. He's from the Canton area, played at Lehigh, and of course LeBron. And we can go on and on with all the names that came out of Ohio. And there's just so many.
Absolutely.
It's just a very talented place. And I don't think a lot of people who don't live in the Midwest understand football, basketball, baseball talent that comes out of Ohio. It's loaded all over the place. So
yeah.
So I want to take you real quick, a couple coaching questions for you. whenever you had conflict on the team, a couple players not getting along or a fight, how did you resolve that?
It's interesting. It always kind of depending on the situation. And again, I think my communication background helped a little bit with some of this. Uh, as I told you, we tried to head off as much of that with the recruiting process as we could. But there's when you got competitive guys, there's always going to be conflict. And we didn't mind that. If guys got a little testy with each other in practice, that's fine. That's going to motivate each one of them to play a little harder. We didn't want, if I'm guarding you and I'm a little soft and I'm letting you score, I'm not helping you any. You're not getting any better. So we would tell our guys, hey, if he's not defending you, get into him a little bit and tell him to be a good teammate and help out. But if there was some conflict and we had to deal with it, then we normally would simply get the two guys together and we would talk about what's creating some of the conflict and what the goals were and try to settle it that way and treat them as men. I think if you treat them that way, they're going to respond that way. So we were fortunate. We didn't have a lot of conflict. And I think that's to the character of the guys we brought in.
And it's you guys, the coaching staff as well. I think it's a culture from on down, of course the guys you brought in, but I think it starts with you guys because you're the one that set the tone for the rest of the team, and on down.
So, well, and the other thing, Brad, is I think with bringing in those kids, we tried to make team more important than self. We never had names on the back of jerseys. We always played for the name on the front of the jersey. And we always talked about us and the team's important. And we stressed, if you wanted to play an individual sport, you should have taken up golf. This is a team sport. It's about the team. It's not about the individual. So, if you miss a class or getting in trouble in the community, you're hurting the team. If you do something good as an individual, it helps the team. So when you stress those kinds of things, guys quit looking at themselves as individuals and look at themselves as part of a team. And again, I think that becomes contagious.
I think it does. It's a great philosophy. And when you took over, so you took over as head coach at Rio Grande and coached for quite a while. What was your mindset going into that? Were you kind of taking over what Coach Lawhorn had done and just expanding it, or were you coming in with your own philosophy?
Yeah, no, our philosophy was developed over the time Coach was here. We understood what Rio was. We were a rural community, and that it's not for everybody. But we had some success bringing some kids in from inner city and from bigger schools. And some of that was, I think, simply the atmosphere of the college. It was safe. Growing up around Cleveland and some of those areas, the cities weren't a safe place a lot of times in the 80s and 90s.
Nope.
And parents wanted their kids someplace where it was a little safer. So we had some success in bringing in kids that came from different backgrounds, but they all had that one thing in common. They all loved basketball. And that's, I think, the same thing that used to really bind all of us together.
And in those years that you coached, getting to the Final Four, I'm sure was a huge, moment. And what was that like? And take us through that process.
Yeah, it was. It was a magical year. It really was. It was a team that really developed as the year went on. We'd struggled some early in the year. We had some guys banged up, and it took us a little while to get going. But once we did, we finished the regular season on a 13-game winning streak. Qualified for the Nationals, went in as I think the 11th or 12th seed. Had a real squeaker in our first game, beat a team of the Dominican out of New York. Then in the second round, we had to beat Evangel College, who was from nearby where we played in Missouri. Then we got to go against the team that was ranked number 3 in the country, Marion out of Indiana, who was just outstanding. And a lot of people had picked them to win the national championship.
Wow.
And it was probably, Brad, in all the games I was ever involved with, probably the best execution of game plan a team of ours ever had.
Really?
We played the number 3 team in the country, and we went in at the half. We're up 42-18.
Oh my God.
And ended up just completely blowing them out. And I can remember their president coming up to me after the game and said, "Coach, I got to be honest with you. I didn't think there was a team in the country that could do to us what you guys did to us tonight."
Wow. And what was your philosophy in that game? How did it, how did you have so much success?
It was one of those things where just as we looked at the tape and we noticed they had a really good point guard, but he couldn't score. He did a lot of things well for him. They had a big kid and then a forward that could really score. So we just kind of devised a plan, and we told our point guards that if their point guard catches it, run to the paint, back off. If he's taken more shots at the half than anybody else on their team, we'll be ahead. And that's exactly what happened. We kind of clamped down everybody else and forced him to shoot it. And he started missing. And the more frustrated he got, the more he missed. And we kind of got our offense on a roll and so on. And it was pretty well over at halftime. Wow. They were demoralized, and we were sky high. So, it was really something special for that group to accomplish something that the Bevo Francis teams never did.
That's unbelievable.
We can tell them you're not going to have anybody that averages 50 or scores 100, but you're the only team in Rio history that's ever made it to the Final Four.
Unbelievable.
So that was a great year. It was a great year.
And is this? My brother told me this. He wanted me to tell you this story. Is it true that Ron Harper, the future NBA star, almost came to Rio?
Yeah. We thought we had him. Well, obviously Ronnie Harper was a heck of a player. Played at Dayton Kaiser, which is defunct now. But he was one of those guys where we thought, all right, we're going to go get in on him. If he doesn't select us, he may bounce back. Well, as we got going, he kind of liked us, and we took a player we had the name of Watson McDonald with us, and he and Watson became pretty friendly. And Ronnie Harper was dyslexic. He had a learning disability, and he had a bad stuttering problem. So he was socially a little awkward, and schools were worried about him academically. And oddly enough, all of a sudden, late in the season, he announces to the Dayton paper that he had narrowed his 2 choices down to Miami and Rio Grande. And Miami's coach, Darryl Hedrick, nearly had a stroke to think that he might possibly lose Ronnie Harper to us. So, but we stayed after him, and he was very gracious. He ended up selecting Miami, and they kind of adjusted some of their academic standards to let him in. And the rest is history. He had a great career there and went on to the NBA. But Ronnie Harper was really a good kid, and you'd only dream about what it would have meant to add him to the teams that we already had.
Oh yeah,
it would have been something pretty special.
And I feel like he's one of those guys that never really gets the credit he deserves for the teams he was on. Obviously, he was on the Cavs for a while, was a great player. And then, we went out
with
west
the Bulls.
Yep. And then the Bulls, of course, that was, he was a very critical part of that team. He never really gets any credit, but you ask anybody on that team, Ron Harper was a very crucial part of that team. He could defend 3 or 4 positions. He was, he could be front of anything. He could score. He could be the lead guard if you needed him to. He's a great player.
And one of the raps on him coming out of high school was they didn't think he'd be able to score like that. They knew he was a great athlete, but his outside shot wasn't developed yet. But he worked very hard and got that developed. And he was such a great athlete. When he decided to lock down on you defensively, you weren't going to score. The Bulls and the Cavs, everybody else, he was going to get the defensive assignment on the other team's best player.
And if
And
you're
Ronnie Harper could lock you down defensively.
Coach, if you remember in the last Dance documentary with MJ and the Bulls, he comes out and talks about the shot in Cleveland when Jordan hit that shot, and he says, I wanted to guard him. I told Coach Wilkins, put me on
Yep.
him, and they put Elo instead. So I'm
Yep.
not saying it would have been different. It's still MJ, but
Yep.
there's definitely a chance it could have been, because anybody could guard of him on that team. It would have been Ron. So
Yes.
to this day, I'm not sure what Coach Wilkins, what his philosophy was, but Ron was a shutdown defender. He's a great defender.
Yeah, he was a great lockdown defender, no question.
And you think about those Bulls teams with him, Dennis, Scotty, and Michael. I mean, how do they could guard anybody with those four guys.
Oh, I think, of course, I'm still biased. I think the 76 Celtics may have been my favorite team of all time.
I was going to ask you about that. Who you think is the greatest of all time?
I love the way that team played. Now, I think Jordan and the Bulls, those guys were very, very good. Some of the Laker teams, but from an old coach who really likes passing. A couple years ago, I set my grandson down and made him watch those great teams from the 80s, the Celtics, the 86 Celtics with Parrish and Bird and McHale and Johnson and Danny Ainge,
loaded,
so on, and how they passed the basketball. They were so slow they couldn't beat anybody off the dribble. But man, they could pass the basketball. They were a great team to watch.
And to show you how great MJ was, he won against that 86 team and scored 63 on them. And I remember at the end, Bird said, they asked him, the guy, who was that guy out there? He said, I didn't know God wore number 23.
Yes.
And I mean, that's how dynamic Jordan was. And Jordan even said back then, to get through Boston, Detroit, I mean, you had to get through so many powerhouses just to get to the finals, not even mentioning winning it. So, and Boston, I feel, is one of those teams that the younger generation don't know how great those teams really were. I have family that grew up there, and they all know about it, of course. But the Garden was probably the toughest place to play, in the NBA history. They were 40-1 that year at home. 40-1.
And one of my great regrets is I never got to see the Celtics play in the old Garden. That was always kind of a bucket list for me, and so obviously it's never going to happen. I got to see them play in Cleveland and so on when they came in, but never got to see them play in the old Garden.
The old parquet floor.
Old parquet floor, and just a magical atmosphere.
Oh yeah, I mean those games. I still watch some of the classic games, and Bird saving it from out of bounds, then coming back in and stealing the ball. I mean, it's just unbelievable.
Absolutely. And you had to be a man to play back then, because they didn't call a lot of fouls. They had the old rule of no layups. So if you got in the paint, you're going to get your head taken off.
Absolutely. I mean, you look
at they may not call it.
And just to think that how the guys like Barkley and Bill Laimbeer and Rodman and of course, McHale, I mean, these are brutal guys. Rick Mahorn would just elbow you and right to the floor. So yeah, it was a very interesting era. And some of the guys I've had on who played in that era will tell you it was nothing. I mean, it was, I had Ricky Pierce on the show, and Ricky was saying how he goes, Brad, there was hand checking back then. And they would, so just, he goes, if I played in today's era, he goes, no disrespect to the guys who play today, because they're phenomenal, but I would score, I could score a lot more than I did back then. And he was a great scorer.
Absolutely. The rules have changed.
Yep.
And the old guys think the guys playing now are wimps.
I know.
They really do. You guys are soft.
I run a 90s page on Instagram, and it's a lot of old players follow my page, and a lot of older fans who love the 80s and 90s. And they always say, they kind of rag on the current era. And I love the current era. I still watch it, of course. So I don't want to rag on those guys too much. But at the same time, the facts are that the rules changed. And I understand why some of them changed. They wanted more scoring. They wanted, I
Absolutely.
get that. But, and obviously, no matter what era you put Steph Curry or Klay Thompson, they're going to score. I mean, they're just incredible shooters. But, again, I watched like a Reggie Miller having to play in the era he did, and how much success he had as a skinny guy. He wasn't that big of a guy, but he was another guy who took his hits, and he was a tough player. And, Larry Bird and those it's amazing that the shooters back then, what they had to go through just to get a shot off.
Yeah. It really was. That they had to work much harder, I think, to get their shots back then. I mean, you can remember Reggie Miller running off of 4 different screens in order to get the basketball. Well, now everything's just, you run a ball screen and then you read where the help comes from. So, there's there's not that much movement anymore. There's more ball movement by the dribble than there is by the pass. So it's an entirely different game than it was 25, 30 years ago.
Absolutely. And a couple more questions for you, Coach. And again, I really appreciate your time today. I want to ask you, did you ever, throughout your career at Rio, did you ever think about relocating, or did you ever have any offers to go anywhere else, or did you always want to stay at Rio?
You know, I always thought about it. I think as a coach at this level, you always, your ego starts working a little bit and you wonder if you could do it at a higher level. But I never really pursued anything. I had a couple of possible opportunities. But one of the things I always said was, and this is a great community to raise family. And I raised two daughters here, and they grew up on campus. It was a safe community. And I always said there were two things I really didn't want to do. One was move, and the other was get fired. And I knew if I went to a Division I job, those things were going to happen several times probably. So I was happy here. There was, other than thinking maybe of some financial benefits, I just never saw any reason that I thought was good enough for me to leave here.
Yeah, I was curious about that because I mean, obviously, with how talented you were and the kind of coach that you were, I know you could have coached other places. But again, D1's a little bit different. It's more of almost like a business now, where after a few years, if you don't succeed or you're not successful, you're gone. And I don't blame coaches for not wanting.
It is.
It's
and obviously it's one of those things where when you go to the Final Four, suddenly somebody thinks you can coach. So there's some interest in people talking about moving, and at that stage again, I just, this was home. And you probably know, I also for my entire career taught full time. So I was a tenured faculty member. And actually doing two full-time jobs. So I was secure in the teaching part. And I thought, there's no reason to give up that security for your family to go and take a risk of taking another job and maybe getting fired in 2 or 3 years. So I was very happy here and really just didn't see any good reason to leave.
I think it makes a lot of sense. I probably would have done the same in your position. I think when you're comfortable somewhere and you're successful somewhere, it's, unless there's a really unique opportunity, I don't know if I would do that, especially with Division I, for example. It's just how fast things can change. In a couple of years, you could be gone again.
Yeah,
so it's
absolutely.
Like you have to really.
I never wanted to get into that.
No, I don't blame you, and I'm kind of similar. It's like when you think about that. If I was a coach, I'd had the same philosophy. If I have success somewhere and I'm comfortable there and I enjoy where I am, why, what would be the point changing again, unless it's very unique opportunity. So I think you look today and it just seems so many, especially with college football, it really is a business where these guys, I mean, some of these guys are leaving before the season's even over. They're already announcing they're going somewhere else. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. So, I really don't like the trend in terms of coaches moving and being fired so quickly. I don't like the trend of the one and dones. I really don't like the whole transfer portal thing because I think kids are going to be bouncing around so much, and it takes away that feeling of identity to an institution. And guys don't get that 3 or 4 years of bonding and playing together anymore that I think is so critical to the team development. And from talking to Brett, his teammates are all still very special to him. Those guys that spent 3 or 4 years together battling, that creates a bond that lasts a lifetime. And I don't know how you develop that on a one and done program.
Agree. And it's like family.
As an old coach now, to get together with these guys and play golf and listen to them and the friendships they have after 20 and 30 years, that's what really makes the whole process worthwhile.
I completely agree. It's like family. I mean, really, even
it really is.
Even to me, I'm the little brother, but I consider those guys like family because I've known them since I was 7, 8 years old. So,
absolutely.
And back then I look at the college basketball back in those days, especially 80s and 90s when I grew up, Coach, and you had Tim Duncan stayed 4 years. I mean, a lot of these guys stayed 4 years, even if they were superstars. And that's why, to me, college basketball, in my opinion, was better then, because you had more rivalries and you got to know guys over a period of years. Where now, and I don't blame these guys wanting to go and get their money. I get it. I do. I mean, if someone flashed millions of dollars in front of me, like Zion, I would probably take it too. But the one thing I feel back then, you just had the rivalries were better, and I feel like you had guys come in the NBA with a little better skill set as far as they're a little more polished. Tim
No
Duncan came
question.
in. I mean, in Tim Duncan's second year, he won a championship because he was polished.
No
And
question.
so I was wondering what your take is on that.
Yeah, I think they're going to have to change the rules. And if kids coming out of high school, if they want to go into the pros, let them do what baseball does. They've got farm teams, or they can take them in, or do certain things. And I think if kids going to go to college, then there needs to be a commitment there for a while. I think it's only fair to the university that recruits them. And I think you've got to take some of the, and I don't think it's going to happen, I'm a purist, but the money has really spoiled the game. When you've got coaches making $4, $5, $6 million a year, and schools bidding on them, that's counter to everything I ever wanted to do in coaching, because then it becomes a business, and you're doing it for the money. And if you're not doing it for the kids and their education and their betterment, then I don't really want that much to do with it.
And it really has turned into a business. And then it's, with all the sports really. And I still enjoy, don't get me wrong, I enjoy watching college basketball and college football, and, it's still great games, but I just don't see as many of the rivalries, as many of the long-term rivalries that you would see back in those days, where you had every year, okay, we're going to see Duke and Carolina, and you would know most of the team. You would know, okay, this guy, that guy. Now it's like, I can't even name half the guys every year because they're leaving so quickly.
Well, and when you listen to the guys, Roy Williams, on why he got out, and some other coaches as to why they're wanting out, and how they feel about the direction of college basketball right now, it's not as fun as it used to be, Brad. It's really not. Guys don't enjoy. Used to enjoy the rivalries. You go to coaching clinics, or you go to the AAU tournaments in Vegas, and we'd all sit together and talk. And now it's just a different atmosphere. And I hate to sound like an old man saying back in the good old days, but it was better then. It really was.
I mean, I think just someone who watched this sport, I can say that it was more fun to watch, because there was just, again, there were more polished players, and the rivalries were more heated, and you got to know. I like getting to know players over a couple period of years, not just one and done.
Absolutely.
So, when those guys became freshmen, you got to know them, and then by the time they were seniors, it was a real heated rivalry with whoever they were facing. So it was just fun watching those guys. And again, I can't blame guys who want to leave earlier and get their paycheck. I get that. And LeBron, for example, he's kind of an anomaly because he's so special. But I get why he went straight to the NBA. I totally understand that, and it worked out for him. But there's a lot of people who went straight to the NBA who maybe were there for a couple of years and they didn't really make it, and then they're out, and so it's a tough. It's a question. I think it's probably an individual thing where guys like LeBron, yeah, I get it, but there's a lot of other guys who probably look back and wish they would have went to college or stayed in college longer.
I agree. But when the money is that accessible,
yes.
As you say, it's how do you pass up
exactly
making that kind of money? So it's hard to blame the kids, but I really don't like the direction of it.
Yep, I understand for sure when it comes to that. And did you back in those days? Let's take it back to the 80s, 90s, and in the early 2000s. Do you have any coaches that you looked up to, whether it's D1, NCAA, NAI, guys you coached against? Who were some of the coaches you said that's a great coach?
Yeah, one of the things we used to do, NAI rules were a little different. We could start practice a little earlier, so we normally started practice October 1st, and we'd go pretty hard for about 2 weeks, and then when Division I was allowed to open up practice, we tried to give our guys 2 or 3 days off, and we would take off and go different places to watch practices, watch what other coaches are doing, talk to them, maybe break down film, and you really picked up a lot. We used to go to Indiana and watch Coach Knight. One of our favorite trips is we'd go to North Carolina, because we could see if the schedules worked out, we could see Duke, North Carolina State all practice in the same day. we'd go to Kentucky and watch them, or call some other places. We'd go to Ohio State and watch practices. So we got to know a lot of those coaches. And as young coaches, even back then, they had a lot of coaches clinics. So we would sign up and go to clinics, and it would be 3 days of some of the best coaches in the country coming in, and you just sat in X and O for 3 days. For example, the best clinic I think I ever attended was a 4-day clinic with Hubie Brown back in the early '80s.
Love Hubie.
And Brad, I filled an entire legal pad of notes from Hubie in 4 days. His assistant at that time was Mike Fratellis when they were with the Hawks. Yeah, was in Milwaukee, and that they were around in they'd come over and talk to guys at night and so on. But until the day I gave up coaching, I would every year go back and open up that yellow legal pad and get words of wisdom from Hubie Brown, because I think he's the most brilliant basketball mind maybe ever.
I love what you say that. Hubie is one of my favorite, analysts of all time. Every time I would watch him, and I love listening to him paint a picture on the screen, because he would tell you, okay, this guy's going to do this. And he would paint it so perfectly. And he's one of my all-time favorite.
He was amazing in the clinic. Now, Fratello did some stuff, but Brad, it was a thing. He came in and he had a session on Thursday night. Then he went all day Friday, all day Saturday, mingled at some mixers at night, talked to coaches, and was supposed to go until noon Sunday. And by Sunday at noon, he had to catch a plane. His back was out, his voice was gone, and they were trying to get him off the court to catch a plane. And it was, I got one more thing for you. And he would be breaking something down with some teams. The guy was an absolute basketball genius on just the little tiny minute details of things fundamentally and what to do. He's still the best basketball mind I think I've ever been around.
Certainly one of the best of all time. I can't tell you how big of a fan I am of Hubie since I was a little kid, because he's done, commentating for many, many years now. And I grew up watching. He was one of the guys I loved listening to. So Hubie to this day is one of my favorite of all time.
Yep.
So
Coach Krzyzewski at Duke, we went down there multiple times and watched their practices, and would get to know him and learn some of his philosophies. Dean Smith, we got to know him a little bit. A little different philosophy than Knight or Krzyzewski. We got to spend a little time with Valvano at North Carolina State. His philosophy was really different. Not one that I would typically adopt, but it fit his personality, and it fit the personality of his players. And if you're going to have a successful program, those things have to jive. And I can remember listening to Al McGuire. Al McGuire would speak at clinics, and he admitted, I don't know much about X and O's. Hank Raymond's my assistant, takes care of X and O's, but I know the philosophy and I know how to lead kids. And he had a book out, the one for offense and so on. He said Hank wrote all that. I don't know. I don't even know what's in there. But his philosophy worked because he recruited kids who would play to that philosophy. So that, there were a lot of ways to be successful. And I think as a young coach, that's probably one of the biggest lessons I learned is your philosophy better match your personality. You better match the school and the community. And all of those things have to jive. And if they do, you got a good chance of being successful.
And if you have one piece of advice for young coaches, just like what you said right here, what would that be for coaches coming up right now? What would you tell them?
Honestly, I think it's swallow your ego and go learn from other people. And again, I learned that from other guys, because there would be times we would sit down with really good coaches. I mean, we would go to Indiana and sit down with Coach Knight and when Jimmy Cruz or Doc each were assistants there, we'd go to Coach K, so on, and ask questions. They would ask us about stuff. Well, what do you do? What's your favorite play to run versus zone on an OB under? So those guys were still learning too. So, as a young coach, you're figuring if these guys are still learning, maybe I don't know it all yet. So I really wish more coaches would start going to coaches clinics again and listening to these guys and sit down and just X and O. It's so much different for coaches now. They don't even have to go scout, Brad. They all they have to do is just turn it on. And they can watch the game on streaming video someplace. We looked at a lot of tape, but I always wanted to see teams in person.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a lot of nights I'd jump in the car and drive up to watch Walsh play, or Malone, or Finley, because I wanted to see them in person, and then drive home that night. I just think we've made it too easy, and I don't know that coaches spend the time learning that they used to spend. Again, that's easy for an old guy to say, but I think coaches need to swallow their ego and try to learn from the people who've really been successful.
I think
it's just you're never too old to learn.
No, and I think it's one of the most valuable lessons is when even now, I try to always ask people who've been doing whatever they've been doing for 20, 30 years, what do you think about this? I mean, I'm never afraid to ask questions because I don't care how stupid they might come off. I want to learn. I want to know how you got to where you got to.
I always thought there are probably some reasons why guys are continuously successful. You're going to have a coach maybe that wins a state championship or a conference championship once, and they think that. But if you're winning every year, it's probably for a reason. Your philosophy's good. You're doing something right to keep that going every year. So go learn from the ones who are continuously successful. Kids may change, the style of play may change, but if that program continues to win, that guy probably knows what he's doing.
Absolutely. Yep. I think it's a great way to look at it. And there's a lot of, because obviously like you said, someone can have a one-hit wonder where they get a special player and he comes along and they win a championship, but to have that philosophy going for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, you got to be doing something right.
You got to be doing something right.
Now, I'll leave you on this. I have one last question for you, and I could talk to you for another 5 hours, but I'll leave you on this. I really could. So when you look back at your career, Coach, what do you want people to know about Earl Thomas?
I've thought about that, and I think our egos get in the way sometimes. I'm less concerned about what they think my legacy is as I am about Rio Grande's legacy, because I spent my whole career here. And the legacy here is going to be Bevo Francis forever. And I just hope when people come into our gym and they look up and they see all those the national championship banners up there, they don't say who the coaches are. They don't have the players listed. So they're just going to remember this program was successful over a period of time. And I think if the program is successful, that helps the institution. And then the other thing that I find out becomes more and more important to me every year as I get older, and that's the relationship with former players. I think for any coach, that's your legacy. How successful your former players are in whatever profession they go into or as family men. And a lot of these guys, and you've been around our program, we got guys that are Fortune 500 vice presidents. We got guys who are superintendents, teachers, coaches in every walk of life that are just incredibly successful. And that's the legacy that I think any coach should aspire to, is what kind of life did your former players have? And maybe did you have a little bit of an impact in creating that? And if that's the case, I'm a happy man.
Coach, I love that. I absolutely love it. That's a great answer. And you should be proud because look at all the different, like you said, successful players who have come out of your program and just having success in life and still getting along and they're all friends now. And it's just you guys really did create a family. I think that's all you can ask.
If they would just take it a little easier on me on a golf course, Brad. I mean, I'm an old guy on a fixed income, and these guys come in and they just kick my butt. They don't show a lot of love on a golf course. It's kind of hurtful.
Do you have anything to roast my brother on? Any good joke or anything he?
Oh, I've got a lot to roast him on. We'll probably keep that just between Brett and
We'll
I.
do that off the. Yeah, we'll do that off.
Yeah, we'll do that off the air sometime. But yeah, I got plenty of stuff. And before we get off, make sure you give your mom and dad, especially your dad, our best. We know he's struggled with some health issues and so on. And we just tell him to hang in there. He's tough. He's going to battle it.
I will. Thank you, Coach. We appreciate that. And again, it's been an honor to have you on the show. And you're
Thanks,
welcome
Brad.
back anytime. It's been fantastic.
I appreciate it. Let's do it again.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay. Bye.